Hey, I'm Patrick. Today, we're revisiting some of the worst Grand Canyon deaths ever recorded. From a woman left dangling 30 feet above the canyon floor with no way back up, to a man showing off dangerous stunts at his own engagement party before everything ended in the most horrifying way imaginable.
It was March 14th, 2019, at Mather Point on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The morning was quiet in a way that made small sounds carry, footsteps and voices drifting farther than expected across the overlook as visitors gathered along the railings. Eric Halverson had driven in from Mesa with his wife and their 3-year-old daughter Leela after postponing the trip more than once. He worked at the same distribution center for nearly a decade, known there as reliable and careful, the kind of employee who tracked expenses in spreadsheets and rarely asked for time off. At home, he showed affection differently, especially with Lila. To calm her frequent anxiety, he relied on familiar physical games, lifting her, spinning her, tossing her lightly, and catching her again. Routines repeated so often they had begun to feel ordinary. The overlook at Mather Point was crowded by 10:30 that morning. Weather advisories had been issued for the canyon rim, with gusts expected to reach 25 miles per hour by midday. Eric's wife later told investigators that she had suggested staying closer to the visitor center, but Eric wanted a photo with fewer people in the background. He walked to a spot roughly 15 feet from the main railing, where the ground sloped slightly, and the edge was marked only by a low stone barrier. Lila had been fussing, pulling at his shirt, and he lifted her to calm her. Witnesses recalled him saying airplane and extending his arms outward the way he always did. On the third lift, Eric held Lila at arm's length, her body parallel to the ground. A gust rose suddenly from the canyon wall at that moment, strong enough that several tourists grabbed their hats. Lila twisted suddenly, arching her back, and her torso slipped through Eric's hands. He lunged forward, fingers grazing her ankle, but she was already past the edge. A woman standing 20 feet away captured the moment on her phone. Eric dropping to his knees, then crawling toward the rim before collapsing. His wife's scream brought other visitors running. Someone placed an emergency call at 10:47 a.m. First responders reached the rim within 8 minutes. A helicopter was dispatched, but the search required technical rope access due to the terrain. Lila's body was located at 12:14 p.m. on a limestone outcrop approximately 290 feet below the rim. The impact site showed no clear evidence of significant intermediate contact. Responders noted that her shoes were still on and her clothing was intact. A regional medical examiner determined that Lila Halverson died from multiple blunt force trauma to the head and torso. The injuries were consistent with a vertical fall onto a solid surface from significant height. Internal examination revealed catastrophic damage to the brain, heart, and liver. Death would have occurred within seconds of impact, likely before conscious pain could register. Eric Halverson was interviewed by investigators over a 4-month period. No criminal charges were filed. A family court later removed his then-infant son from his custody after a psychological evaluation and risk assessment. Eric relocated to Nevada in early 2020 and has not spoken publicly. Additional warning signs were installed at Mather Point that summer, specifically advising against holding or lifting children near cliff edges. The footage captured by the bystander was never released to the public, both to protect the family's privacy and because of the graphic nature of the content. Additional warning signs were installed at Mather Point that summer, specifically advising against holding or lifting children near cliff edges. It was May 27, 2016, at the Bright Angel Trailhead on Grand Canyon's south rim, where early tourists crowded near the canyon's edge before the heat arrived. A man crouched with a juniper stick to move a coiled rattlesnake and never made it home. Kurt Bellamy, 38, worked as a small equipment mechanic outside Denver, mostly servicing skid steers, trenchers, and small excavators used by landscaping crews and utility contractors. The work kept him outdoors more than most shop mechanics. He spent long stretches at construction yards and equipment depots scattered along Colorado's Front Range, often stepping around scrap lumber, irrigation piping, and sun-warmed gravel lots where snakes occasionally turned up. He had grown up clearing fence lines on his uncle's cattle property near Pueblo, where rattlesnakes were common and sometimes turned up under feed troughs or irrigation culverts. Bellamy had handled them and said so often, usually describing it as something routine from those summers working pasture repairs. He wasn't a practiced hiker. The Arizona trip was a long weekend with co-worker Martin Keene, 41, who had been talking for months about seeing the canyon in person after a supplier conference brought them both within driving distance. Their plan was loose: walk part of Bright Angel Trail before the midday heat, take photos, and be back in town by the afternoon. Bellamy carried no trail gear and no emergency equipment. At 9:10 a.m., a 4-foot Grand Canyon pink rattlesnake lay coiled in the shade at the base of the trailhead signboard, pressed against the post on cooler ground. Several hikers had already noticed it and were keeping their distance along the edge of the trailhead clearing. Bellamy picked up a juniper stick and told the group he would move it before someone was hurt. Lydia, a retired biology teacher from Tucson, standing roughly 12 feet away, told him directly to leave it alone. Bellamy crouched within 2 feet of the snake and prodded it near the tail. The snake tightened its coil and lifted the tail as the rattle accelerated into a dry buzzing warning. He prodded again near the mid-body. The strike was immediate. Lydia later told rangers the snake barely appeared to move. Bellamy's left hand jerked backward. 2 fang punctures were visible within seconds between his thumb and index finger, both bleeding. The surrounding tissue began swelling within minutes. A nearby visitor flagged a park ranger walking the rim trail. The ranger examined the wound and radioed dispatch recommending medical evacuation. Bellamy refused on cost grounds and said he felt fine. He and Keene began descending the trail. At 0.7 miles below the rim, uphill hikers found Bellamy seated on a trailside rock, while Keene wrapped his hand with a bandana. The swelling had moved past the wrist. He was sweating and complained of nausea and dizziness. At 1.3 miles from the rim, he collapsed onto the trail. His arm was swollen to the elbow, his face pale gray, his breathing shallow. Keene could not rouse him. Keene flagged a passing hiker carrying a satellite messenger who contacted park dispatch at 11:32 a.m. Rangers reached Bellamy approximately 48 minutes later. He was unconscious with intermittent breathing. A helicopter transported him to a regional hospital in Flagstaff, arriving roughly 2 hours after he collapsed. Antivenom was administered on arrival, but organ failure had already advanced due to the treatment delay. Renal failure developed during the progression of the systemic collapse. Bellamy died 31 hours after the bite. Park officials issued a brief seasonal advisory against approaching or relocating snakes on park trails. The incident was logged in the annual Park Incident Report and received limited regional news coverage. Keene gave a statement to rangers and left that afternoon. No policy changes followed, and the trailhead resumed normal traffic the following morning. It was August 23, 2016. A narrow tributary canyon branched off the Grand Canyon's main drainage corridor. Ochre and rust-colored walls rising 90 feet on both sides, framing a flat, sandy wash roughly 8 feet wide. Faint horizontal staining marked the lower rock surfaces at varying heights. The air inside was still and hot. Cassia Trentholm was 38 years old and worked as an elementary school science teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She had spent 11 years teaching earth science and weather units to middle schoolers across the district. She was on a solo day hike to document sedimentary layering, visible only in the lower drainage walls of this tributary, a trip planned months in advance. Colleagues later described her as deeply confident in her understanding of desert weather systems, someone who trusted her academic background to keep her ahead of conditions that caught less informed hikers off guard. Earlier that morning, on the main trail, Cassia had stopped to explain cloud formations to a couple she'd just met, pointing at the building cumulus over the plateau, naming the cloud categories, and telling them she could read from the formation that any storm was at least 4 hours out. The couple later gave statements to investigators confirming the conversation and the timeline. A flash flood warning sign was posted at the main trailhead, roughly half a mile from the tributary entrance. No barriers blocked the tributary mouth. A day hiker near the tributary entrance later told investigators he had a clear sightline roughly 600 feet into the narrow canyon. He could see Cassia crouching near the far rock face. He described hearing a low rumble from the plateau direction. Beginning as a vibration, he felt more than heard before rising to a sustained roar within seconds. He watched a wall of brown water and debris fill the canyon behind Cassia's position, approaching rapidly from deeper in the tributary and filling the full width of the wash. He watched her stand and turn up canyon toward the sound. She moved immediately to the nearest wall, hands searching the surface, shifting along the base. The walls were smooth, the same polished limestone that had produced the horizontal staining on the lower surfaces. He could see no features on either side that would allow a person to climb above the water line. The water reached her within seconds. The full force of the drainage funneled through the 8-foot wide wash with no room to dissipate. She was swept off her feet and carried toward the mouth. The day hiker scrambled to higher ground as floodwater, carrying branches, rock fragments, and dense sediment, discharged violently from the canyon mouth into the main corridor. He called emergency services immediately. Recovery teams located Cassia's body 1.3 miles downstream the following day. Her notebook, recovered from debris, confirmed she had been documenting strata, the final entry, an incomplete sketch. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be drowning with contributing blunt force trauma to the head and upper body consistent with debris impact. Meteorological data confirmed a storm cell had developed 14 miles northwest over the plateau, entirely outside visual range from inside the tributary. Plateau runoff channels into isolated drainages and arrives at canyon floor level with little warning until seconds before water reaches a given position. The Trail Authority installed prominent flash flood warning signage at the tributary entrance the following season.
It was October 3rd, 2014, and narrow sandstone walls rose 80 feet on either side of a slot canyon, branching off the main gorge in a remote section of the Grand Canyon backcountry, where filtered morning light barely reached the floor and the temperature dropped noticeably within the first 100 feet of the entrance. Auden Callister was 29 years old and worked as a dental hygienist in Cedar City, Utah. 3 evenings a week, she climbed at an indoor bouldering gym, where she had progressed quickly over 2 years. She owned a canyoneering harness, a rappel device, and a 150-foot static rope. Her regular climbing partner, a certified canyoneering guide, handled all technical rigging and carried the group's ascending gear on every trip. That weekend, they had planned to run a moderate route through the Slot Canyon. 3 rappels, the final one listed in route guides as requiring a minimum of 200 feet of rope. Her partner canceled the morning of the trip. Auden decided to go alone. She had never soloed a canyoneering route. A fellow canyoneer entering the same canyon that morning later told investigators he passed Auden at the entrance while she rigged her anchor sling. She told him her partner had bailed on what she called the easy one. He noticed her rope bag appeared smaller than what most people carried for that route, but said nothing. Auden completed the first 2 rappels without incident. The third dropped into a deep, narrow section where the canyon floor was visible more than 100 feet below. She set her anchor roughly 10 feet further back from the lip than the established rigging point, a common error that reduces the usable length of the rope, and began her descent. Roughly 90 feet down, her hands reached the end of the rope. She was suspended approximately 30 feet above the canyon floor, full weight on the harness, feet braced against damp sandstone. The stopper knot locked against her rappel device. She had no ascending device, no Prusik cord, no friction hitches. Without proper ascending equipment, climbing back up the rope was extremely difficult and could not be sustained for long. The canyon floor was visible directly below her, close enough to make out individual rocks, far enough that the fall would be unsurvivable. She tried to climb. Gouge marks from her rappel device showed she had attempted to pull herself upward on the rope using arm strength alone, gaining a few feet at most before sliding back to the same position. She tried to traverse. Boot scuff marks and chalk residue spread across a 15-foot horizontal range on the sandstone face, her feet pushing sideways, searching for a ledge, a crack, anything that could take her weight. There was nothing. The sandstone in that section was smooth and damp. Every feature she tested gave way or offered nothing to grip. I need you to sit with what that means. Suspended 30 feet up, nowhere to go, watching the light change on the canyon floor below her for what investigators estimated was 1 to 2 hours. Her legs began to fail first. The boot prints on the wall drew closer together, no longer extending fully, no longer reaching as far. Her lateral movement narrowed. The attempts to traverse stopped. The marks near the end were concentrated in a tight cluster directly below her hanging position. Small, shallow scuffs, barely indentations. She was no longer searching. She was just trying to shift her weight. Then the marks stopped entirely. Her body was discovered the following morning by a canyoneering group running the same route. She was still on the rope 30 feet above the canyon floor, slumped forward in her harness, arms hanging at her sides. The rope had not failed. The harness had not failed. She was exactly where she had been when the rope ran out. That image, still on the rope, 30 feet from the ground, with nothing broken except the math on her rope length, is the one from this entire video I can't get out of my head. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be positional asphyxia secondary to prolonged suspension in a climbing harness. As exhaustion depleted her ability to reposition, the leg loops and waist belt progressively restricted her ability to breathe until it stopped. Investigators confirmed her 150-foot rope was insufficient for the final rappel from her chosen anchor position, and that she carried none of the ascending equipment necessary to self-rescue. The Land Management Authority installed route-specific signage at the canyon entrance listing minimum rope lengths and requiring ascending gear. Her climbing gym in Cedar City held a memorial and launched an outdoor transition clinic series.
It was October 2nd, 2013, and the afternoon light at Lipan Point cast sharp shadows across the metal railing where a mother stood holding her 8-month-old son against her chest. The overlook was moderately crowded, and visitors waited their turn to step close to the railing. Helicopters passed overhead periodically, and the air carried the faint scent of dust and pine from the canyon below. Rachel Kim had arrived with her mother just after 2, driving up from temporary housing near where her husband was stationed. She was 27 and had given birth to her son the previous February. She had no family nearby and spent most days alone while her husband worked long shifts. Her online presence was extensive. She maintained a parenting blog, an Instagram account with over 2,000 followers, and posted daily updates in multiple forums. Friends later described her as anxious and perfectionistic, someone who read every parenting book and second-guessed every decision. She had been diagnosed with postpartum anxiety 3 months after her son's birth, but had stopped attending therapy after 2 sessions. Her infant was fussy and startled easily, and Rachel had developed a habit of holding him constantly to keep him calm. This constant vigilance, born of anxiety and isolation, may have amplified the risk at the overlook. Lipan Point is a popular South Rim overlook with a waist-high metal railing along the edge. The vertical bars were wide enough for small objects or limbs to pass through. That afternoon, Rachel stood at the railing with her son in her left arm, leaning forward slightly to angle her phone for a selfie that would capture both of them with the canyon behind them. Her mother stood a few feet behind, holding a diaper bag. The drive to capture the perfect image placed them closer to danger than most visitors realized. At approximately 2:37, a helicopter passed nearby, its noise sudden and loud. Several witnesses later described the sound as startling, and one tourist's video captured the moment. The infant jerked violently in Rachel's arms, arching his back and twisting his torso. Rachel's grip shifted, her hand slipping from his back to his leg. She tried to pull him closer, but his body squirmed again, and he slid downward through her arms. His small torso passed between two of the railing bars before Rachel could react. She lunged forward, her hand grazing his foot, but he was already gone. The accident occurred within seconds, leaving no observable opportunity for intervention. Rachel screamed and grabbed the railing, trying to climb over it. Her mother and two nearby tourists pulled her back as she thrashed and shouted. Another visitor called emergency services at 2:38. Responders arrived within 9 minutes, but the terrain below Lipan Point is steep and heavily vegetated, making immediate recovery impossible. A helicopter was dispatched at 2:51, but the search required technical climbers due to the angle of the slope. The infant's body was located at 4:17 on a rocky ledge, approximately 800 feet below the overlook. The sheer depth and isolation of the drop underscored the overwhelming helplessness of the situation. A post-mortem examination determined that the infant died from catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head and torso. The injuries were consistent with a fall from significant height onto a hard surface. The skull was fractured in multiple places, and there was severe internal bleeding. Death would have occurred within seconds of impact, likely before the infant could experience prolonged distress. The fall happened immediately after the infant slipped from her arms, resulting in fatal injuries within seconds. Rachel Kim deleted all of her social media accounts within a week of the incident and ceased public communication. Her family declined to speak with investigators beyond initial interviews, and she and her husband relocated out of state within 2 months. No charges were filed. The aftermath left her completely isolated, a private grief unseen by the wider public. Internal safety reviews were later conducted at overlooks along the South Rim. Within 18 months, modifications were made at Lipan Point and 3 other locations to reduce the spacing between vertical bars. Though no official announcement referenced the incident directly, the slow, systemic response illustrates how preventable hazards often persist until tragedy forces action. It was May 22, 2015. The Colorado River carved through the inner canyon, its deceptively smooth surface hiding forces that had claimed lives since humans first dared navigate these waters. James Whitford, a 45-year-old ET specialist from Sacramento, stood at the river's edge, watching sunlight dance across what appeared to be calm water. Within minutes, the river would prove him fatally wrong. James wasn't new to rivers. He'd spent weekends kayaking California's gentler waterways and had completed a handful of guided rafting trips on Class 2 and 3 rapids. Friends described him as confident, sometimes overconfident, with a tendency to dismiss safety briefings as overly cautious. He'd joined a commercial rafting expedition through the Grand Canyon, attracted by the adventure but dismissive of the river's reputation. His wife had encouraged the trip, hoping it would break his monotonous work routine managing network servers for a regional healthcare company. That morning, the group had pulled into a sandy beach along the river after navigating several moderate rapids. James had handled the morning runs well enough, though his guide noticed he frequently second-guessed instructions. During the lunch break, their guide warned the group not to enter the water in certain sections, where hydraulic holes can trap swimmers in a violent recirculating current that repeatedly drags them underwater. They said that James listened, but seemed unimpressed. The guide had stepped roughly 25 feet away to check a snapped raft line, leaving James temporarily unsupervised. James spotted a section that looked mirror smooth from shore. He removed his life jacket, placing it deliberately on a rock, and stripped down to swim shorts. 2 rafters from his group watched, but didn't intervene, assuming he knew what he was doing. James waded in confidently, the water initially only waist deep. He pushed forward, beginning to swim with strong, practiced strokes. Within 5 strokes, everything changed. The current, moving at nearly 8 miles per hour beneath the calm surface, grabbed him like a powerful hydraulic force. spinning his body in violent turbulence. A fellow rafter named Sarah estimated he traveled roughly 180 feet in about 10 seconds. James's head went under, then resurfaced briefly as he was swept toward a hydraulic hole near the bend. The recirculating feature caught him instantly. His body spun violently, disappearing beneath churning white water, reappearing seconds later in a grotesque tumble, then vanishing again. The hydraulic held him in its grip, rotating him through the churning cycle, like laundry in a washing machine. Sarah screamed for the guide, who reached the shore in time to see James's body surface one final time, face down, arms limp, before the current released him and swept him around the bend. The guide used a commercial VHF radio. Dispatch acknowledged the call at 1:49 p.m., and a Park Service call-out was authorized by 2:10 p.m. Two rafters launched a kayak in pursuit. They hesitated briefly because of the turbulence, but followed the body's trajectory downstream, unable to reach it before it disappeared into the canyon's next section. Park Service rescue teams mobilized within 30 minutes, deploying search crews along the river corridor. Recovery operations continued for 3 days, hampered by the river's icy temperature, high flow, and complex canyon terrain. James's body was located 2 miles downstream on May 25th, wedged against submerged rocks in a shallow eddy. The medical examiner's report listed drowning as cause of death, with multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with violent water turbulence and repeated impact with submerged rocks. Estimated time of death was within 5 minutes of entering the water. The rafting company issued internal safety protocol reminders, but faced no legal action, as James had violated explicit instructions. Park rangers later posted additional warnings along the river corridor about the dangers of swimming in fast-moving sections of the Colorado River. It was October 14, 2017. Afternoon light angled low across the Grand Canyon's South Rim Trail, where the path narrowed to roughly 3.5 feet between a sheer drop on one side and a vertical limestone wall on the other. A group of desert bighorn sheep, including one mature ram, rested near the trail edge. Ingrid Van Broeklen was 61 years old and had recently retired after 32 years as a dental hygienist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She had no wilderness experience. The Grand Canyon had been on her bucket list for over a decade. This was her first visit, traveling with her adult daughter. Earlier on the trail, at a wider section, a park ranger had advised Ingrid to maintain distance when she was photographing the group from roughly 30 feet. She acknowledged the warning. The ranger continued along the rim. Over the following 20 minutes, Ingrid resumed closing the gap. 3 separate passing hikers told her to move back. She responded each time that she wasn't bothering them. Her daughter had fallen roughly 80 yards behind. She'd stopped at a wider section to rest and adjust a boot. Per the daughter's later statement, she told her mother she would catch up in a moment. Recovered footage from Ingrid's phone showed that in the final recorded segment, she was approximately 8 feet from the dominant ram, narrating a video message to her grandchildren back in Minneapolis. She described how gentle the animals looked and told them not to let anyone tell them otherwise. 2 hikers approaching from the opposite direction later told investigators they could see the ram's posture as they neared. Ears flattened, weight shifted forward onto its front legs. Ingrid stepped to her left to improve her camera angle, closing the distance to roughly 5 feet. The ram rose from its resting position. The 2 approaching hikers described the shift as immediate. Head dropped, neck stiffened, weight loaded forward. The charge covered the distance in under 2 seconds. The impact caught Ingrid at the hip and left side as she turned partially toward the trail interior. The trail width offered no lateral escape. The limestone wall to her right, the canyon dropped to her left. The force carried her over the canyon side edge. The 2 hikers called emergency services immediately. Ingrid's daughter returned to the section approximately 4 minutes later. Recovery required a technical rescue team and several hours. Ingrid was airlifted from the canyon and transported to a regional trauma center where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be left-sided rib fractures with a flail segment, pelvic ring disruption, and a basilar skull fracture consistent with a fall of approximately 170 feet. Wildlife behavior consultants confirmed the ram's response was consistent with pre-rut territorial aggression. In the weeks preceding the late November rut peak, mature rams become significantly less tolerant of close approach and can escalate from rest to a full charge with minimal observable warning. Park Wildlife Management expanded mandatory approach distance signage at all identified bighorn activity zones on the rim trail. The grandchildren received a copy of the earlier trail footage from that morning per the family's request.
It was March 15th, 2019, and pale morning light crept down the limestone switchbacks of a canyon trail as a line of 10 mules plodded single file toward the canyon floor, their hooves scuffing loose gravel on a path barely 8 feet wide with a wrangler leading at the front and another trailing at the rear. The ride was operated by a small, permitted outfitter that had been running guided mule trips into the canyon for over 2 decades. Garson Thibault was 62 years old and had spent 34 years delivering mail along the same rural route outside Lafayette, Louisiana, retiring just 3 months earlier. His daughter Colette, 34, had booked the mule ride as a retirement gift, a surprise she revealed at his farewell party in front of the entire post office staff. Garson smiled and thanked her. He never mentioned that the thought of riding an animal along a cliff edge made his stomach drop. He had avoided heights his entire adult life, ladders, overpasses, even the upper deck of the football stadium in Baton Rouge. He had never told anyone. The outfitter's pre-ride screening required riders to disclose any physical limitations or discomfort with heights. Garson answered no to every question. Colette stood beside him at the desk, and that's the detail that kills me, because the screening existed. The question was asked. He just couldn't answer it honestly with her standing right there. Wranglers assigned him a mule near the center of the string, 5th of 10, with Colette riding 3 positions ahead. Other riders later told investigators that Garson gripped the saddle horn so tightly, his knuckles turned white from the moment the mule stepped onto the trail. Each time Colette looked back, he released his grip and gave a stiff, controlled wave. One rider behind him observed this pattern repeating multiple times within the first 20 minutes. The rear wrangler noticed and called out reminders to sit back and loosen his grip, but the spacing between riders limited how quickly she could reach him. As the group approached a switchback roughly 45 minutes in, the trail narrowed and bent sharply back on itself. The inside wall sat within arm's reach, while the outer edge dropped toward a steep, rocky slope several hundred feet below, with no railing or barrier. The mules ahead moved through without hesitation, following the inside line. Garson's mule did the same, but Garson did not trust it. On the switchback, Garson's posture changed visibly. He leaned hard toward the wall, pulling the reins tight against his chest, the opposite of the relaxed position wranglers had demonstrated. His mule halted and balked, refusing to move with the erratic weight shifting on its back. The rider behind called out to the rear wrangler, and this is where everything speeds up, because what happens next takes less than 5 seconds. Before the rear wrangler could push forward past the riders between them, Garson attempted to dismount, shifting his weight abruptly and uncontrolled off the saddle. His left boot caught in the stirrup, and the uneven shift pulled him sideways over the mule's flank, sending him off the outer edge of the trail. The terrain below the switchback was not a sheer cliff. It was a steep, uneven slope of loose scree and fractured rock angled at roughly 50 degrees. Garson tumbled down the slope, his body striking rock surfaces at irregular intervals, limbs catching on outcroppings that redirected his trajectory but did not stop his momentum. The rider directly behind him watched the entire descent. She later described the sound, rock breaking loose with each impact, growing fainter as the distance increased. Dust rose in a visible trail behind him. The mule remained motionless on the trail. Colette, 3 positions ahead and around the bend, did not see the fall. She later told investigators she heard shouting, but assumed a mule had stumbled. She did not learn what happened until the lead wrangler halted the string and walked back to her position. Rangers later reported she had to be physically prevented from attempting to descend the slope herself. From the reports I went through, she didn't stop trying to get past them until they told her he was already gone. The rear Wrangler radioed park dispatch immediately. Emergency responders reached the slope within 40 minutes using a technical rope team. Garson was located roughly 180 feet below the trail, unresponsive, wedged against a rock shelf. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including bilateral rib fractures, severe traumatic brain injury, and internal hemorrhaging, consistent with repeated impacts across the slope. The outfitter suspended operations for 3 months, pending a safety review. It was the first rider fatality in the company's history. Collette established a memorial scholarship fund for rural postal carriers through a workers' association in Lafayette.
It was August 19th, 2018, and the late afternoon heat at Shoshone Point had driven most visitors back toward the main overlooks, leaving the unmanned area quiet except for the occasional gust of wind moving through the ponderosa pines. The point itself extends out over the canyon with no guardrails or barriers, just open rock and sparse vegetation near the edge. Small groups of hikers were visible in the distance along the main trail, but the overlook was otherwise empty. Daniel and Marissa Cole had parked their rental sedan in the small dirt lot just after 3, the only vehicle there. They were both 36 and had been married for 11 years. Daniel worked as an insurance adjuster, and Marissa managed a dental office. Friends later said the relationship had deteriorated after Daniel lost a promotion and began drinking more frequently. Marissa had suggested separation twice, but Daniel had resisted, insisting they could fix things. The anniversary trip to the Grand Canyon was his idea, planned as a way to reconnect away from the pressures of daily life. Shoshone Point is a permit-only overlook accessible by a dirt road and a short trail, but enforcement is inconsistent and many visitors ignore the closure. That afternoon, the area was completely empty. Forensic analysis later identified an unintended audio recording from Daniel's phone, which captured nearly 18 minutes of sound. The audio began with muffled conversation, then escalated into raised voices, then shouting. At approximately 4:12, the audio captured the sound of Marissa's voice rising sharply, followed by Daniel's voice overlapping hers. There was a sudden scuffling noise, then a loud smack, consistent with a physical altercation. Marissa's voice became louder, and Daniel's voice shouted a single obscenity. A moment later, there was a heavy thudding sound, then the distinct noise of shoes scraping on rock. Marissa screamed once, a high and short sound that cut off abruptly. The audio then recorded Daniel breathing heavily, followed by the sound of footsteps moving quickly away. The suddenness of the act left no time for intervention or prevention. Within 6 months, barriers and warning signs were installed along that section of the rim, following a series of safety reviews. No photographs or recordings of Samantha's fall were recovered, and no visual documentation was ever made public, preserving the privacy of the family and witnesses who had been present. Daniel ran back down the trail and flagged down a park staff member near the main road at 4:27. He was visibly shaking and told the staff member his wife had fallen. Responders reached Shoshone Point within 15 minutes and found scuff marks near the edge and a small pile of disturbed gravel. A helicopter was dispatched at 4:41. Marissa's body was located at 5:34 on a steep slope over 1,000 feet below the rim, partially obscured by juniper trees and loose rock. The vast drop made the reality of her death inescapably clear to those on the rim. A post-mortem examination determined that Marissa Cole died from multiple catastrophic internal injuries, consistent with a high-speed vertical fall. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, severed spinal cord, ruptured aorta, and massive internal bleeding in the chest and abdomen. Death would have occurred within seconds of impact. Bruising on her upper arms and shoulder, consistent with being forcefully pushed, was noted in the report. Daniel Cole was arrested 2 days later and charged with second-degree murder. The charge was later reduced to manslaughter, after forensic analysis of the audio and scene reconstruction suggested the push occurred during a heated argument rather than premeditated intent. He was convicted in March 2019 and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The legal outcome, while certain, could not undo the tragedy that had occurred. The audio recording was later used in domestic violence prevention training programs by various law enforcement and safety organizations. Marissa's family established a small memorial fund in her name and successfully lobbied for increased signage and patrols at remote overlook areas. It was April 22, 2017. The south rim of the Grand Canyon stretched under cloudless Arizona skies, concealing dangers that would claim a life before the day ended. Paul Detweiler, a 39-year-old insurance adjuster from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, stood at the edge of an unmarked trail, his brand new hiking boots still stiff from the box he'd opened 2 days earlier. Paul wasn't an experienced hiker. His outdoors resume consisted of forum posts claiming expertise and a few YouTube videos he'd watched the night before. Friends described him as overconfident, the type who researched topics online, then proclaimed himself knowledgeable. He discovered an unofficial overlook mentioned on hiking forums, where users repeatedly warned about unstable ledges and dangerous conditions requiring technical climbing gear. Paul apparently dismissed these warnings, posting that he could handle it without ropes like a pro. His only preparation was reading internet threads and packing a backpack with water and snacks. The backpack weighed approximately 28 pounds and contained no safety equipment. That morning, Paul began his descent along a narrow limestone ledge, approximately 250 feet below the rim. The Grand Canyon's layered rock formations drop 6,000 feet in places, with sedimentary limestone particularly prone to crumbling under pressure. His untested boots pinched with every step as he navigated the roughly 250-foot-long ledge carrying his overweight pack. An experienced backcountry hiker moving along the canyon wall noticed Paul immediately, observing his reckless movements with growing concern. Paul hopped over loose rocks without testing them, occasionally pressing footholds with one finger before committing his full weight. The ledge gradually narrowed from 2 feet to barely 7 inches wide, forcing him to lean outward with his back against the canyon wall. The backcountry hiker watched as Paul paused at the narrowest section, appearing to force a nervous chuckle about living on the edge, before continuing forward along the crumbling path. Likely realizing he'd reached a dead end, Paul attempted to reverse course on the 7-inch ledge. His stiff, unbroken-in boots had no flexibility, the rigid soles unable to feel the polished limestone beneath them. His right foot slipped first, the boot's tread finding no purchase on the smooth rock surface worn down by centuries of wind and water erosion. Paul's arm shot out instinctively, grabbing at the canyon wall. The soft limestone crumbled under his fingers like chalk, offering no hold. His left foot kicked frantically, trying to regain the ledge, but the weight of his backpack pitched him backward into empty air. For 6 full seconds, Paul fell through open space, his body rotating head over heels as gravity accelerated him toward the rocks below. The backcountry hiker heard one sharp shout, then nothing. Paul's body tumbled violently, limbs flailing unnaturally as he fell through open space. He impacted a jagged projection, approximately 200 feet down, the sound echoing across the canyon like a gunshot. His body continued rolling another 50 feet before coming to rest on a narrow shelf. The backcountry hiker immediately radioed park rangers at 11:47 in the morning. The technical rescue team arrived in approximately 40 minutes, rappelling down with ropes and medical equipment. Paul showed no signs of life upon first assessment. The medical examiner's report listed massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, multiple compound fractures throughout the body, and catastrophic internal bleeding as causes of death. Time of death was estimated at 11:46 in the morning, within seconds of impact. Recovery operations took 4 hours as rangers carefully extracted Paul's body using rope systems. His family was notified that evening. Park officials used the incident to reinforce warnings about unmarked trails and the critical importance of proper equipment and training. It was May 6, 2018, when late morning heat pressed against the canyon walls roughly 650 feet below the Grand Canyon's south rim. The upper cliff face was carved into deep recesses and overhangs of pale sandstone, and a steep limestone face dropped away below the trail, its lower reaches disappearing beneath a broad overhang. Phoebe Tulloch was 44 years old and worked as a real estate agent in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had traveled to the Grand Canyon that week with a specific goal: to recreate a photograph she had seen online. Friends later described her as someone who treated desert terrain the way she treated open houses. Familiar ground she believed she could read at a glance. She had no technical climbing background. The photo, taken from across the canyon at a different elevation, showed a wide recessed ledge beneath an overhang with an unobstructed panoramic view. The image had been the wallpaper on her phone for nearly a month. Friends later told investigators she referenced it constantly, describing exactly where she would stand and what time of day the light would be perfect. The ledge could be reached by leaving the trail and descending a 35-foot limestone face using natural handholds visible from above. No barrier marked the departure point. A solo hiker ahead of Phoebe later told rangers he watched her step off the trail and begin climbing down toward the recess below the overhang. Photos recovered from Phoebe's phone later confirmed she reached the ledge. The images matched the same angle seen in the social media photo she had been trying to recreate. The ledge itself measured roughly 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep beneath the overhang. There was no water and no visible route continuing downward. Investigators believe the problem began when Phoebe attempted to climb back out. Scrape marks and disturbed rock on the limestone face showed where her hands and shoes had searched for purchase. The same holds that allowed a descent from above angled away when approached from below, offering little grip for upward movement. A second section of the face showed broken handholds that had crumbled under pressure. Farther east, disturbed rock plates marked a third attempt. Investigators estimated she climbed roughly 15 feet before the fractured surface shifted and slid, sending loose debris back down toward the ledge. Evidence on the rock face suggested repeated attempts over an extended period. Based on the timeline provided by the solo hiker, investigators estimated Phoebe remained trapped on the ledge for several hours during the peak afternoon heat. By that point, the surrounding south-facing sandstone walls had been absorbing direct sunlight for hours. The overhang trapped heat within the recess, hot rock radiating inward from 3 sides while the overhang blocked airflow. The solo hiker later reported the off-trail descent to a ranger while returning along the trail. Rangers searched the area above first before initiating an off-trail response. The overhang concealed the ledge from the rim and limited visibility from helicopter observation along the canyon face. Technical rescue teams staged overnight and rappelled down the following morning. When responders reached the ledge, Phoebe was unresponsive. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be heat stroke and hyperthermia resulting from prolonged exposure. Investigators concluded the recessed ledge had created an enclosed heat pocket where surrounding rock radiated absorbed solar heat inward, producing temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding canyon air. The Trail Authority later installed off-trail warning signage at the departure point along the South Kaibab Trail. Phoebe's phone, recovered from the ledge, still contained the photographs she had taken recreating the image. A caption for the post had already been drafted in her notes app. It was never published.
It was June 22, 2018, and the parking lot near the South Rim Village sat empty past midnight, lit by a single overhead lamp casting a pale circle across the asphalt where a hatchback with Oregon plates idled near a sign listing shuttle schedules and trail regulations. Elam Orozco was 23 years old and worked as a bike courier in Portland, earning roughly $14 an hour peddling deliveries through downtown traffic. His roommate later told investigators Elam had been planning his Grand Canyon trip for weeks, calling it the free version. No backcountry permit, no campground reservation, no guided tour. The plan was to descend the South Kaibab Trail at 2 a.m., sleep on a ledge below the rim out of ranger sight, and hike out before morning patrols. His roommate also described his gear. The headlamp was a dollar store model he had owned for 3 years. The batteries had never been replaced. His pack contained a sleeping pad, a thin blanket, 2 energy bars, and a single liter of water. No backup light, no map, no satellite communicator. He told his roommate he would be back by Tuesday, but gave no itinerary and no specific return date. And I think that right there is what makes this one so much worse. Nobody was expecting him anywhere. There was no one waiting for a call that didn't come. The road to the South Kaibab trailhead is closed to private vehicles. Elam parked in the general lot and walked roughly 20 minutes to the trailhead, a workaround he had found on hiking forums. The trail has no water sources, no tree cover, and no guardrails on its exposed switchbacks. Cloud cover that night blocked any moonlight. Beyond the rim, the canyon was a void. Investigators later reconstructed what followed entirely from physical evidence on the trail. He descended at a normal pace. His boot prints held the established path cleanly for roughly the first mile, steady, evenly spaced, someone who believed his light would hold. At a steep switchback approximately 1.2 miles below the rim, where the trail bends sharply with a severe drop-off on the outer edge, the packed surface and the loose gravel beyond it look nearly the same in low visibility. In daylight, the drop-off is unmistakable. In total darkness, the distinction all but disappears. No curb, no edge, no obvious change in ground feel to tell a hiker where the trail ends and the air begins. His boot prints crossed that boundary. Scuff marks appeared in the loose gravel at the trail's outer edge, along with a small fan of displaced rock pushed outward, 1 foot stepping past the packed surface and finding nothing solid beneath it. The terrain off the edge drops roughly 40 feet onto a narrow rock shelf before continuing steeply into deeper canyon terrain. Elam's body was found on that shelf, face down, his pack still on, the headlamp strapped to his forehead with the switch in the on position and the bulb dark. He was not found for 2 days. The shelf sat below the sightline of hikers on the upper switchbacks, despite heavy daily traffic on the trail. A hiker descending 2 days later spotted his body from a lower switchback at an angle that revealed the ledge. No missing person report had been filed. His roommate assumed he was still traveling. His car sat in the general lot, indistinguishable among dozens left by multi-day backpackers. But falling 40 feet onto a rock shelf did not kill Elam Orozco. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe hyperthermia and dehydration. Injuries from the fall, a fractured pelvis and multiple rib fractures, were debilitating but not immediately fatal. Drag marks in the dust extended roughly 6 feet from his landing position to where his body was found. His water bottle was recovered empty. Daytime temperatures on exposed South Kaibab rock exceed 130 degrees at ground level in June. He lay on that shelf, immobilized, no water, no shade, no phone signal, and no way for anyone to know he was there, through what investigators estimated was most of the following day in direct sun. I've sat with that detail for a while now, and it's the worst thing in this entire video. He survived the fall. He was alive when the sun came up, and the canyon cooked him in broad daylight while hundreds of hikers walked directly above him. The headlamp he never replaced the batteries in put him on that shelf. The desert finished it. The Park Service referenced the incident in a seasonal advisory about unpermitted night hiking. Elam's identity was confirmed after rangers traced his plates to a Portland address and contacted his roommate.
It was April 14th, 2015, and the mid-morning sun had already begun to heat the exposed rock near Desert View, where the official trail gave way to a network of unmarked scramble routes used by visitors seeking unobstructed views. The trail sloped steeply in places, and guardrails ended well before the edge. Small groups of hikers moved along the rim, while the quiet of the canyon carried distant voices and shifting gravel. Samantha Lee had arrived with 3 friends just after 9 a.m., parking in the main lot before walking east along the rim. She was 23 and in her second year of a geology program at university. She had taken 2 field courses and worked a summer internship with a mining survey company. And she often told friends she could assess rock stability by sight and touch. Her social media accounts showed dozens of photos of her perched on unstable formations in state parks and public lands, usually alone or far from marked trails. She carried a small digital camera that day and wore hiking sandals instead of boots, despite the loose terrain. Her friends later said she had ignored repeated suggestions to stay on the main path. The area Samantha chose to climb was a sloped section of limestone and sandstone, both prone to fracturing and erosion. Prior geological reports had documented repeated rockfall incidents in that zone, but no barriers or warning signs had been installed. Samantha climbed roughly 15 feet above the trail, stepping across loose stones and fractured slabs. Below her, the Morales family from El Paso had stopped to rest, with the parents taking photos while their 2 children, ages 7 and 9, sat on a flat section of rock. One of Samantha's friends called up to her, asking her to come back down, but she waved him off and continued higher. At approximately 9:42 a.m., Samantha placed her weight on a flat slab of sandstone roughly 2 feet across. The rock shifted immediately and broke free from the slope. As it moved, Samantha lost her footing. She tried to step backward, but the gravel beneath her sandals gave way. Multiple witnesses saw her fall backward, sliding several feet before dropping over the edge of the rim. The dislodged rock followed seconds later, breaking apart as it struck the cliff face. Samantha disappeared from view almost instantly. Her friends ran to the edge, shouting her name, but could not see her below. One of them called emergency services at 9:44. Responders arrived within 11 minutes, but the terrain required a technical recovery. An aerial search located Samantha's body at 10:53 on a rocky ledge approximately 680 feet below the trail. A post-mortem examination determined that Samantha Lee died from massive blunt force trauma to the head and torso. The injuries were consistent with an uncontrolled fall from significant height onto uneven rock. The skull was fractured, the spine was severed at the thoracic level, and multiple internal organs were ruptured. Death would have occurred within seconds of impact. No evidence suggested she was conscious after the fall. The Morales family and other witnesses were treated for shock at the scene and later released. Samantha's friends were interviewed and returned home the following day. Within 6 months, barriers and warning signs were installed along that section of the rim, following a series of safety reviews. Samantha Lee's death was later included in a memorial database maintained by a nonprofit organization tracking fatal accidents in public lands. It was June 14th, 2016. The South Rim at Pipe Creek Vista shimmered under afternoon heat that could kill as efficiently as any fall. And by day's end, Hector Villalobos would discover both truths in the worst possible sequence. Hector wasn't reckless by nature, just overfamiliar. The 28-year-old landscape photographer from Tucson had hiked the Grand Canyon's trails dozens of times, capturing sunrise shots and dramatic rim perspectives for his growing portfolio. He'd built a modest following on social media, showcasing Arizona's landscapes, earning enough through print sales and local gallery exhibitions to supplement his part-time work at a photography supply store. Friends described him as talented but casual, the kind of person who'd hike in sandals because he knew the terrain. For this climb, he wore worn hiking boots and gripped natural handholds along the pillar, relying entirely on his experience rather than any protective equipment. That morning, Hector had posted on social media about his plan to climb a pillar at Pipe Creek Vista for an unobstructed lunch view. A climber reportedly saw him arrive at the pullout around 11:30 in the morning, carrying only his camera bag, a sandwich, and a half-empty water bottle. The temperature was already 94 degrees and climbing. In summer, the Grand Canyon's inner gorge can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with rock surfaces heating far beyond that. Under those conditions, dehydration can set in quickly. A couple eating lunch at a picnic table near the parking area watched Hector scale the pillar using natural handholds. The ascent took roughly 8 minutes. The pillar's summit was flat enough to sit, perhaps 6 feet across, surrounded by sheer drops on 3 sides. They observed him settle in, unpack his lunch, and appear to be eating while checking his camera. The couple finished their meal over the next 20 minutes, discussing their afternoon plans, occasionally glancing at the pillar where Hector remained visible as a small figure against the sky. When they looked again, at 12:45 in the afternoon, Hector was gone. The woman initially assumed he'd climbed down while they weren't watching, but something about the empty pillar troubled her. Her husband walked to the edge of the viewing area and scanned downward, seeing nothing unusual. They returned to their car, dismissing the concern. 15 minutes later, a hiker on the rim trail below the vista heard what she initially mistook for a rockfall. Moving around a switchback, she encountered Hector's body sprawled across an angular slab of limestone 30 feet from the pillar's base. His limbs were positioned unnaturally, his head angled wrong. Blood pooled beneath his skull where it had struck the rock. The body lay unbraced, arms at his sides, rather than extended defensively. The hiker immediately called emergency services at 1:02 in the afternoon, her voice shaking as she described the scene. Park rangers and emergency medical technicians arrived within 20 minutes, hiking down the nearby switchback trail to reach the body. The medical examiner's report noted multiple skull fractures consistent with high-impact blunt force trauma, along with fractured ribs and internal bleeding. No defensive injuries appeared on his hands or arms. Core body temperature at recovery suggested severe hyperthermia. The determination concluded he had likely lost consciousness from heat stroke while seated on the pillar, then toppled forward during the resulting collapse, falling 40 feet and landing unbraced on the uneven rock surface. Death occurred on impact. The park's ranger station logged the incident as an accidental fatality related to heat exposure and unauthorized climbing. The incident prompted rangers to reinforce existing warnings about off-trail climbing and extreme heat exposure. Park signage warning against off-trail climbing was noted in the report, highlighting that Hector had ignored official guidance. Hector's camera, recovered with his body, contained his final photos: lunch, sky, canyon views. It was October 17th, 2013. Late afternoon light was already fading from the lower switchbacks of Bright Angel Trail. The canyon's layered walls pushed shadow deep into the corridor hours before sunset reached the south rim above, and the temperature dropped noticeably with every 100 feet of depth. Stellan Krug was 57 years old and had spent 28 years as a postal carrier in Denver, Colorado, walking residential foot routes in every season. He was nearing retirement. His wife later told investigators he had never considered himself a hiker, but in 28 years of walking, he had also never encountered a route his legs couldn't handle. He was visiting the canyon for the first time on a long weekend. That afternoon, he had been walking the paved South Rim Trail when he passed the Bright Angel Trailhead and decided on impulse to descend a short distance before driving back to his motel. He carried one partially full water bottle, no food, no headlamp, no map, and a light jacket. His phone had not been fully charged that day, later confirmed through device forensics. Trail signage at the trailhead warned against descending without adequate water, food, and a light source. He called his wife from the trailhead before descending. She later told investigators he said he was going just a little way down and would be back before dinner. She recognized the phrasing immediately. He used it Every time a short walk turned into 3 hours. Stellan descended roughly a mile and a half before reaching a small rest area along the trail. By then, the canyon walls had already swallowed most of the daylight. The switchbacks below were fading into shadow. He turned around and began the climb back toward the rim. Within minutes, the trail interior grew far darker than the rim above. Switchbacks carved into the rock face began blending into the surrounding terrain. At one of those turns, roughly a mile below the trailhead, Stellan stepped off the established path. Boot impressions later showed where his route continued onto a nearby slope that appeared to angle upward toward the rim. The ground ahead rose and fell in shallow ridges and drainage channels. In darkness, that terrain can feel like steady uphill progress even while gradually losing elevation. The tracks continued across the slope for an extended distance. His phone, later recovered from the site, had powered off earlier that evening after the battery depleted, leaving him without a light source. Eventually, the boot impressions stopped. Stellan's final position was found approximately 380 feet below the point where he had left the trail, more than a mile to the east in the canyon's inner drainage terrain. By then, he was alone in complete darkness, with no light, no communication, and only a light jacket intended for the warmer temperatures on the rim. His wife contacted the Park Service when he failed to return by 10 that evening. Search teams deployed immediately, but nighttime off-trail operations in that terrain were not feasible. His body was located the following morning, seated with his back against a rock where his boot impressions ended. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be hypothermia, with contributing severe dehydration. Overnight temperatures in the drainage dropped into the low 40s, consistent with weather station data. No traumatic injuries were found, no fall, no impact. He stopped walking and the temperature killed him. Investigators confirmed his route traveled consistently away from the rim. The canyon's layered drainage topography disrupts spatial orientation in darkness, making perceived uphill movement an unreliable navigation reference. The Trail Authority added explicit light source advisory language to Bright Angel trailhead signage within the month. His wife gave an interview to a regional hiking safety publication several months later. She asked only that people charge their phones before going for a walk.
It was April 9th, 2016, and heavy mist drifted upward from a 190-foot waterfall deep inside a tribal reservation side canyon west of the main Grand Canyon corridor, where red walls funneled the roar of falling water into a sound that drowned out conversation beyond 10 feet. Jessamine Hightower was 33 years old and worked as a travel nurse on a 13-week contract at a hospital in southern Nevada. Between shifts, she hiked locations across the Southwest for a blog she had maintained for 2 years. 30 bucket list hikes before her 35th birthday. The waterfall was number 22. Her hiking partner, a respiratory therapist from a previous assignment, later told investigators that Jessamine planned the entire trip around a single available day between shifts. The itinerary required a 10-mile hike in, the waterfall descent, photos, and the 10-mile return, all before she needed to sleep ahead of a 12-hour night shift the following evening. Her partner described her checking the stopwatch on her phone between every rest stop, insisting they reach the falls by noon for the light. There was no professional photography obligation. The light in the narrow canyon was consistent at any hour. By the time they reached the waterfall, Jessamine had been hiking for nearly 5 hours in canyon heat near 90 degrees. Other hikers at the falls were resting and hydrating before attempting the descent. A steep, partially tunneled route down the cliff face beside the falls, roughly 60 vertical feet, with metal chains bolted into wet travertine rock as the only handhold. Most hikers took 15 to 20 minutes, methodically testing each foothold and resting their forearms between moves. Jessamine started down immediately. A group of 3 hikers sitting at the top of the chains watched her go. One of them later told investigators he almost said something. She hadn't taken a drink of water, hadn't sat down, hadn't even set her pack down. She just walked to the edge and started climbing over. A hiker ascending in the opposite direction later told investigators she moved past him quickly, gripping the chain with both hands and stepping down without testing footholds first. He described her hands as visibly wet, mist, and sweat. He pressed himself flat against the wall to let her pass and watched her continue downward at what he called twice the pace of anyone else he had seen on the chains that day. He said she never once stopped to rest her forearms or shake out her grip the way every other hiker did on the descent. Roughly 40 feet into the 60-foot descent, the ascending hiker, now above her and still watching, saw her rhythm change. Her right hand repositioned on the chain twice in quick succession instead of moving to the next link. Her left foot searched for a hold, slipped, found another. Her movements were no longer fluid. Her right hand slid down the chain, not a controlled release, but a slow giving way. The mineral film on the wet metal defeating what was left of her grip. Her left hand held for another half second, fingers tightening, knuckles locked. Then her left foot slipped off its hold, and the sudden drop of her lower body weight ripped her remaining hand from the chain. I went back through that detail several times, because that's not one clean mistake. That's everything failing at once. Wet metal, fatigue, 5 hours of heat, and a grip that had nothing left. She fell roughly 20 feet onto a travertine ledge near the base of the falls. The impact was direct and vertical. The ascending hiker shouted and began descending toward her. Jessamyn's partner, hearing the commotion from the top, looked over the edge but could not see the ledge from above. Hikers at the base of the falls reached her within minutes. Emergency communication required a satellite messenger carried by another group. A helicopter medical team reached the site roughly 90 minutes later. Jessamyn showed no signs of life. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic cranial trauma with cervical spine fractures consistent with vertical impact onto rock. Contributing factors included prolonged exertion in heat and reduced grip capacity on mineral-coated surfaces. The Tribal Land Management Authority installed warning signage at the descent point. Her hiking partner published blog entry number 22, the one Jessamyn never finished.
It was May 3rd, 2017, and the air above Bright Angel Point on the North Rim was still and cold in the minutes before sunrise. The canyon was quiet, the shadows long, and the path along the rim narrowed where the guardrails ended. Occasional birds called in the distance, and the sound of wind moving through the cliffs carried faintly across the overlook. Caleb Monroe had parked his truck in a maintenance access lot just after 4:30 that morning, bypassing the main entrance to avoid fees and any interaction with staff. He worked as a freelance drone videographer, taking contract jobs for real estate agencies and outdoor brands, but the income was inconsistent, and he had been behind on rent for 2 months. Caleb had logged over 120 base jumps in the past 4 years, most of them from legal sites in Utah and Idaho. Friends later said he had become fixated on filming high-risk stunts that could go viral, convinced a single breakout video would lead to sponsorship deals. He had mentioned the Grand Canyon jump repeatedly over the past 6 months, describing it as a career-defining move. Security footage from the parking lot showed Caleb pulling his wingsuit from a duffel bag and checking his parachute harness under the truck's dome light. He wore a helmet-mounted camera and carried a small backup camera in a chest pouch. The wingsuit itself was an older model he had purchased used online, and he had repaired a seam tear near the left arm with fabric glue 2 weeks earlier. Weather data from that morning showed wind speeds averaging 8 miles per hour at ground level, but canyon topography creates unpredictable turbulence near cliff faces, especially during temperature inversions at dawn. Caleb hiked beyond multiple closure signs to reach a rocky promontory roughly a quarter mile from the main overlook. At approximately 5:52, over a mile away, 2 early morning hikers on the south rim noticed a dark figure leap from the north rim. One of them had binoculars and observed the figure wobbling and spinning. A section of torn fabric was later found snagged on a sharp limestone outcrop below the launch point. suggesting Caleb had clipped the rock during his exit. The helmet camera recovered later showed the first 3 seconds of the jump, the horizon tilting violently, Caleb's gloved hands reaching for the pilot chute, and then the image shaking as his body began to tumble. The recording cut off abruptly at the 4-second mark. All recovered video footage was retained as evidence and was never released publicly, both to protect privacy and because of the graphic nature of the fall. Media outlets briefly obtained still frames from an unknown source, which were later removed following a lawsuit filed by Caleb's parents. The 2 hikers called emergency services at 5:55. Responders were dispatched immediately, but locating the entry point and coordinating a recovery team took over an hour. An aerial search reached the North Rim at 7:18 and began a search pattern. Caleb's body was found at 8:43 on a steep talus slope approximately 720 feet below the launch point. The wingsuit was shredded in multiple places, and the parachute had not deployed. A post-mortem examination determined that Caleb Monroe died from massive blunt force trauma, consistent with high-speed impact against rock. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull with brain herniation, a completely severed spine at the thoracic level, and rupture of all major internal organs. The pattern of injuries indicated he had struck the cliff face at least twice during the fall before hitting the ground. Death would have been instantaneous. An investigation into the incident was opened, and all recovered video footage was retained as evidence. Media outlets obtained still frames from an unknown source and published them online. Caleb's parents filed a lawsuit and won an undisclosed settlement, and the images were removed. The case has since been cited in training materials for managing illegal high-risk stunts in protected areas. It was April 18, 2015. Along a remote section of the Grand Canyon South Rim, a limestone edge jutted over a 400-foot vertical drop into the canyon below, and Tyler Cassian was about to perform his last stunt. The engagement party had been going smoothly until the 26-year-old decided the weathered rock would make a perfect stage for what he did best. Tyler had built a modest following in Las Vegas, performing urban parkour. His social media showed him vaulting concrete barriers, scaling parking garages, and jumping between rooftops in the downtown arts district. He worked nights as a casino floor supervisor, training during the day at a local gymnastics facility where he'd refined his technique for 3 years. Friends described him as confident to the point of reckless, someone who never turned down a physical challenge. He'd driven up from Vegas specifically for his college roommate's engagement celebration, arriving that morning with his signature wrist guards and grip-enhanced shoes. Tyler had no experience with natural terrain. His world was concrete, metal, and predictable surfaces. The Grand Canyon's South Rim is carved from Kaibab limestone, a sedimentary rock that weathers unevenly, creating deceptive footholds and surfaces that can crumble without warning under sudden pressure. The private gathering of 18 guests had just finished the engagement toast when Tyler spotted a gap between 2 rock formations roughly 8 feet apart, positioned directly above the sheer drop. The morning dew hadn't fully evaporated, leaving a thin moisture layer on the stone that wasn't immediately visible. A bridesmaid, in a coral dress, stood 12 feet away, champagne glass still in hand. As Tyler announced he wanted to show everyone something cool, he didn't test the surface, didn't check for loose rock or grip quality. Tyler simply backed up 15 feet, stretched briefly, and committed to a hurried running approach toward the gap. 3 other guests had their phones out, anticipating another one of his viral-worthy performances. Tyler's approach was textbook perfect, his form identical to dozens of successful jumps captured on video back home. But limestone isn't pavement. His left foot planted on the edge for launch, and the moisture-slicked surface provided 0 friction. His shoe slid outward violently, and his body pitched forward over the rim at a high, but slightly cautious speed. The bridesmaid's scream cut through the celebration as Tyler disappeared. His body struck a couple of protruding rock formations during the initial descent, each impact breaking additional bones and tearing tissue. His trajectory was unpredictable, and he finally came to rest on a narrow ledge about 200 feet below the rim, wedged between some boulders. Multiple people at the party called 911. Park rangers reached the remote section of the south rim 18 minutes later, carefully making their way along a narrow maintenance trail. From the rim, they could see Tyler's body resting on a ledge far below. The medical examiner's report documented massive blunt force trauma to the chest and head, multiple fractured vertebrae, and severe internal hemorrhaging. Death likely occurred within seconds of the first impact. The engagement party disbanded quietly. Most guests left within the hour. The celebration irreversibly shattered. Park officials recovered Tyler's specialized parkour shoes and wrist guards from his body, meaning that he had likely planned a stunt in advance. The incident was logged in the park's records as an accidental death by fall, one of several fatal falls reported along the canyon's rims that year. Tyler's family declined to speak publicly about the tragedy. It was November 8, 2014, at a remote section of the Grand Canyon's south rim, roughly 2 miles from the nearest maintained overlook. The limestone face at the rim edge dropped approximately 140 feet to a wide inner canyon shelf. No other visitors were present. The only sound was wind moving across open rock. Ferris Delahousse was 29 and worked as an auto body technician in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He had no hiking or climbing background, but was comfortable working with mechanical systems and rigging in the shop. He had driven to the Grand Canyon with a co-worker for a weekend of day hiking, bringing along a rappel setup he had built himself. Co-workers later told investigators he had spent several weeks assembling and testing the rig after hours, running rope over an overhead beam in the shop, and hanging from a harness made from nylon webbing to check his knots and friction setup. He told them he planned to find a place at the canyon worth roping down to. The system consisted of 200 feet of braided nylon utility rope purchased from a hardware store and the homemade webbing harness. At the rim, Ferris chose a juniper tree with exposed roots as his anchor point. Ferris wrapped the rope around the trunk, rigged his friction setup, and leaned his full body weight back to test the anchor. The tree flexed slightly but held. He stepped over the rim and began lowering himself down the limestone face while his co-worker watched from above, the rope sliding across the bark of the juniper. About 30 feet below the rim, Ferris paused to adjust his grip and reposition his feet along a shallow seam in the rock. His co-worker later told investigators the rope had begun cutting deeper into the bark as Ferris shifted his weight below. A few seconds later, he heard a dry cracking sound from the direction of the tree. The juniper tilted forward slightly. Loose soil shifted around its exposed roots. Before Ferris could climb back up the rope, the anchor failed. The root mass tore free from the rim in a single motion, the entire juniper pitching forward over the edge. Ferris dropped the remaining distance to the inner shelf below. The rope and the uprooted tree followed immediately behind him, along with a spray of loose dirt and rock dislodged from the rim. The co-worker lost sight of him as the fall disappeared below the edge. Emergency services were contacted within minutes. Park rangers and a technical rescue team descended by rope from the rim to reach the inner shelf where Ferris had landed. He was found unresponsive, and paramedics confirmed fatal head and thoracic trauma consistent with a high-velocity fall. Investigators later determined the juniper anchor had failed because erosion on the downslope face had left the root system embedded in loose, unconsolidated soil. While the tree held during the initial lean test, the sustained loading from the rappel caused the weakened roots to pull free from the rim. The Land Management Authority installed no rappelling signage at that section of rim within 2 months. At the shop where Ferris had tested the rig, co-workers later noticed scuff marks still visible on the overhead beam he had used during his practice runs.
It was July 28th, 2017, and dark monsoon clouds stacked in towering columns south of the Grand Canyon's south rim, their bases flat and bruised purple against the plateau as humidity pressed down through thin air at 7,000 feet. Sigrid Bjornstad was 44 years old and had coached cross-country and track at a high school in central Minnesota for 14 years, producing competitive distance runners from a school of fewer than 400 students. Colleagues described a coach who built her reputation on toughness, a philosophy rooted in the flat farmland, where Minnesota storms rolled in visibly from 30 miles away and usually veered south or dissolved before reaching the practice fields. That July, Sigrid had organized a voluntary preseason conditioning trip to Arizona. 4 graduating seniors who had turned 18 that spring and 2 assistant coaches. Not an official school activity. The group had spent 2 days running at lower elevations near Sedona before driving north to the South Rim for their final morning. Sigrid's plan was a group jog along the paved rim trail, a flat, scenic path following the canyon edge through exposed sections and areas with stone overlook structures. The group began shortly after 8. Warm, humid, clear overhead. The dark cloud mass to the south was visible from the trailhead. One assistant coach, raised in Tucson, pointed it out and suggested keeping the run short. Sigrid glanced at the clouds and told the group they looked mean but never delivered. 2 of the seniors later confirmed she said it twice, once at the trailhead and once roughly 20 minutes into the jog. It was the same phrase she used every time a storm built over the practice fields back home. And that's the thing that makes this one cut different from the others. She wasn't ignoring the warning. She genuinely read the sky the way she'd read it for 14 years. The sky just worked differently here, and no one corrected her in time. 40 minutes in, the first thunder echoed across the canyon, deep and close. The assistant coach from Tucson immediately called for the group to turn back. Sigrid was at the front of the loose formation, on a fully flat, exposed section of paved trail. No stone structures, no trees, no shelter of any kind within immediate reach. The nearest covered overlook sat roughly 200 feet behind her, where 3 of the runners had already slowed near the structure. The 2 assistant coaches and the 4th runner were between Sigrid and the shelter, spread across 50 feet of trail. The sky darkened rapidly. No rain fell. The thunder was closer now, rolling directly overhead instead of echoing from the south. A single bolt struck the exposed section of trail. Sigrid was on open, flat ground with no cover, roughly 50 feet ahead of the nearest person. The 2 assistant coaches closest to her position later described a blinding white flash and an immediate concussive sound that knocked one of them sideways. When their vision cleared, Sigrid was on the ground. The 3 runners near the overlook had dropped to the pavement at the sound. The assistant coach from Tucson reached her within 30 seconds. She was unresponsive, not breathing, no pulse. He began CPR immediately. The other assistant coach ran toward the nearest developed area to reach park dispatch. An entrance burn was visible on Sigrid's right shoulder. An exit burn had split open the sole of her left running shoe. From shoulder to shoe, that's the path the bolt took through her. I spent a while looking at that detail in the examiner's notes, and I still don't fully know how to process it. No other member of the group was injured. Park rangers arrived within 12 minutes. Advanced life support was initiated and unsuccessful. Sigrid was pronounced dead on the trail. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest, resulting from direct lightning strike, with secondary electrical entrance and exit burns. The bolt's path through her torso was consistent with immediate and irreversible disruption of cardiac rhythm. The school district implemented mandatory weather monitoring and lightning safety protocols for all off-campus athletic activities, including voluntary trips. The Park Service reviewed lightning shelter spacing along the most exposed rim sections, noting no covered structure existed within 200 feet of where Sigrid was struck. Her team dedicated the fall cross-country season in her name.
It was September 9th, 2016, at a trail near the Yavapai Geology Museum. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows along the rim where the path narrowed and the guardrails ended. Visitors walked in small groups, and the quiet of the canyon was broken only by distant voices and the occasional breeze. Monica Ruiz had parked her rental car in the small lot with her German Shepherd, Rex, secured on a 6-foot leash. She had driven up from Albuquerque the day before for a veterinary conference and added the canyon visit on a whim after one seminar was canceled. She had worked as a veterinary technician for 16 years, specializing in behavioral management for large breed dogs. Rex, her personal pet and demonstration animal, weighed 92 pounds and had a history of lunging at small animals. Though Monica believed she had it under control, she habitually looped the leash twice around her wrist to maintain firm handling during walks and demonstrations. The trail that afternoon was moderately busy. Observers later noted that trash bins near the overlook had not been recently serviced, and food scraps left by tourists had drawn an unusual number of squirrels and chipmunks to the area. At least 3 hikers later said they had seen Monica walking Rex along the rim path and noticed the dog pulling repeatedly, his attention fixed on the ground and the rock walls. One witness recalled Rex stopping abruptly twice to stare at movement in the brush, his body going rigid. Monica continued walking each time, tugging him forward. At approximately 4:37, Monica stopped near a section of trail where the path curved close to an unrailed edge. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, appearing to check a message or take a photo. A hiker, wearing a chest-mounted camera, was roughly 40 feet behind her and captured some of what happened next. A squirrel darted from behind a rock directly in front of Rex. The dog lunged with full force, twisting mid-leap. The leash snapped taut instantly, wrenching Monica's wrist and pulling her off balance. Her body jerked sideways, feet skidding on loose gravel, and she shouted once before pitching forward over the edge. Rex, still leashed, went over with her. In an instant, the familiar control she had relied upon turned against her. The hiker with the camera screamed and ran toward the edge, but stopped several feet back. Another visitor called emergency services at 4:39. Responders arrived within 12 minutes, but the terrain required a technical rescue team with ropes and harnesses. A helicopter was dispatched at 5:02. The search took nearly 2 hours due to fading light and the depth of the fall. Both bodies were located on a sloped ledge approximately 600 feet below the rim, partially obscured by juniper trees. The canyon's depth magnified the helplessness of the situation, making rescue nearly impossible. The footage captured by the hiker's camera was never released publicly, both to protect the family's privacy and because of the graphic nature of the incident. A post-mortem examination determined that Monica Ruiz died from catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head, spine, and chest. The fall caused multiple skull fractures, a severed spinal cord at the cervical level, and rupture of the heart and lungs. Death would have occurred within seconds of the initial impact. Rex sustained similar injuries and died on impact as well. His body found less than 10 feet from Monica's. Monica's training business, which operated under her name, was sued 8 months later by a former client who claimed she had been taught the wrist loop technique and suffered a shoulder dislocation when her own dog lunged. The case was dismissed on procedural grounds, but legal fees forced the business to close. Monica's family declined to speak publicly, and her social media accounts were deleted within weeks. Even her professional legacy was quietly erased in the wake of the accident. Updated guidance was issued in early 2017, emphasizing proper leash handling techniques near cliff edges. Additional signage was installed at Yavapai Point and other unrailed sections of the South Rim Trail system. It was May 18, 2015, when the river bend below the old footbridge churned with unprecedented force. Spring snowmelt had transformed the normally placid waterway into a torrent of muddy water, rushing between moss-covered boulders. The current moved at nearly twice its usual speed, carrying debris from upstream and creating dangerous hydraulic formations where water recirculated against submerged obstacles. Warning placards posted at the bridge access clearly indicated hazardous conditions, but the remote location meant few people would encounter them during weekday hours. Orson Glint, a 52-year-old seasonal fishing guide, had spent over 2 decades navigating cold mountain waters. His weathered face and calloused hands reflected countless hours spent teaching clients to read currents and identify productive fishing spots. Known for his methodical approach to water safety, Orson possessed an intimate knowledge of seasonal flow patterns and typically avoided dangerous conditions. However, his confidence in cold water environments had been built through years of experience during normal flow periods, not the extreme conditions created by heavy snowmelt. The spring runoff had pushed water levels well above normal parameters, creating conditions that even experienced guides rarely encountered. Orson had arrived to assess whether the river would be suitable for client trips in the coming weeks. His plan involved testing the current strength and identifying safe entry points for future guided excursions. Wearing chest-high waders and heavy boots designed for rocky stream beds, he approached an unofficial access point downstream from the bridge, where he had safely entered the water countless times before. The submerged rocks that normally provided stable footing had become treacherous with a coating of algae and increased water pressure. As Orson stepped into the current, his boots slipped on the slick surface of a boulder he had used as a stepping stone for years. The rushing water immediately pulled him toward a hydraulic formation created by the elevated flow over a submerged rock shelf. His body was drawn into the recirculating current where water flowed over the obstacle and then back upstream in a continuous loop beneath the surface. The hydraulic pinned his torso underwater against the rock shelf while his legs were caught in the rotating flow. Despite his experience and strength, the mechanical force of the water prevented him from pushing off the bottom or swimming clear of the entrapment. The chest waders, designed to keep him dry in normal conditions, now worked against him by trapping air and affecting his buoyancy in unpredictable ways. Each attempt to surface was countered by the downward force of the hydraulic, which continued to rotate his body back toward the rock shelf. Submerged and unable to reach air, his oxygen reserves depleted rapidly as he struggled against the relentless current. Orson's movements gradually weakened as asphyxia progressed. His body held firmly in the hydraulic's mechanical cycle. The frigid snowmelt water worked as a secondary assault on his system, though oxygen deprivation would claim him long before cold could incapacitate him. His final attempts to break free grew progressively weaker as prolonged submersion prevented him from reaching air. Hours later, search teams recovered his fishing gear nearly a quarter-mile downstream, providing the first indication of the incident. His body was located along the riverbank the following day, having been released from the hydraulic after the current shifted slightly due to changing water levels. The medical examiner confirmed asphyxia due to hydraulic entrapment as the cause of death. Investigators documented the extreme flow conditions and noted that even experienced water professionals could be overwhelmed by the mechanical forces created during peak runoff periods. The unofficial access point was subsequently marked with additional hazard warnings, and local guide services implemented stricter protocols for assessing water conditions during the snowmelt season. It was October 14th, 2018. The north rim of the Grand Canyon stretched into darkness as a 32-foot rented recreational vehicle inched backward toward an unguarded cliff edge, its reverse lights casting white beams into empty air where solid ground should have been. Randy Forster, a 55-year-old insurance adjuster from Columbus, Ohio, had spent 3 decades behind a desk processing claims. His wife, Sheila, 53, worked part-time at a local credit union. Neither had ever driven anything larger than their Honda sedan before renting the RV for their anniversary trip. They chose the North Rim specifically for its reputation as less crowded than the South Rim, hoping to capture sunset photographs from Cape Royal Road's scenic pullouts despite signs at the road entrance warning that vehicles longer than 22 feet were not permitted. They arrived at the Cape Royal area just after sunset, realizing too late they'd miscalculated the drive time. Randy wanted to turn around at a narrow pullout approximately 800 feet from the main parking area, rather than continue forward in unfamiliar darkness. The pullout measured roughly 40 feet wide, with no guardrails or barriers clearly marking where the pavement ended, near the canyon's 200-foot drop. North Rim pullouts were designed decades earlier for standard vehicles, not modern RVs exceeding 30 feet in length. In darkness, the visual distinction between solid ground and void disappeared entirely. The RV's large blind spots made Sheila almost invisible in the mirrors until the vehicle's rear wheels were already on loose gravel. At 7:45 in the evening, Randy began his three-point turn. Sheila stood outside the passenger door, attempting to guide him, using hand signals barely visible in the RV's side mirrors. Her voice carried warnings, but Randy, plausibly concentrating on maneuvering, likely could not hear her over the engine and the wind. A motorcyclist traveling southbound stopped his bike approximately 50 feet away, keeping his headlight aimed at the scene to provide additional illumination. He later told investigators the RV's positioning concerned him immediately. Randy pulled forward, angling the vehicle's nose toward the road. He shifted into reverse, checking his passenger mirror where Sheila stood waving her arms. The rear wheels slipped instantly on loose gravel at the pullout's boundary, causing the back end to pivot downward. The ground beneath the rear wheels gave way instantly, and the vehicle's back end dropped, its frame pivoting downward at a steep angle. Sheila, standing directly behind the passenger side, had no time to move. The descending RV's rear corner struck her torso with devastating force, sweeping her over the edge. The 12,000-pound vehicle tumbled end over end down the rocky slope. Metal tore against stone, shattering windows and collapsing the roof structure. Randy instinctively braced for the turn, but his weight threw him against the disintegrating interior as the RV rolled violently. Glass shredded upholstery and flesh alike. The vehicle completed 2 full rotations before sliding another 30 feet, finally stopping on a flatter shelf 200 feet below the rim. Sheila's body came to rest 40 feet from the wreckage, wedged between 2 boulders where the initial impact had thrown her. Emergency crews from the ranger station arrived in 22 minutes, following the motorcyclist's call. Both victims were pronounced deceased at the scene. The medical examiner's report listed Randy's cause of death as multiple blunt force trauma, including severe head injuries and internal bleeding. Sheila died from massive thoracic crush injuries and traumatic asphyxiation. Her chest cavity collapsed from the RV's initial impact. Recovery crews removed the wreckage 3 days later using heavy recovery equipment. Existing advisories at the site had warned only against off-trail hiking, not oversized vehicle maneuvers. Following the incident, park officials reviewed safety signage, though no physical barriers were installed. It was February 9th, 2018, when the snow-covered geothermal depression lay hidden beneath a deceptively uniform blanket of white. The basin, formed by underground thermal activity, sat lower than the surrounding terrain, allowing gases released from below to settle during winter months. Temperatures had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, causing steam from geothermal vents to condense and freeze, creating thin snow bridges over the active thermal features. The pristine snow cover masked the dangerous geology beneath, while winter snowfall had partially buried the seasonal warning signs. Rogan Skeff, a 41-year-old overnight courier, had spent years navigating remote routes during the darkest hours when most people slept safely indoors. His work required him to traverse isolated areas in all weather conditions, developing an intimate knowledge of shortcuts and alternative paths that could save precious time on long-distance deliveries. Known for his reliability and willingness to tackle challenging routes that other drivers avoided, Rogan possessed the kind of methodical confidence that came from years of successful navigation through difficult terrain. The depression had caught his attention as a potential shortcut that could reduce his travel time by nearly 30 minutes on a route he traveled weekly after winter road closures forced him to continue on foot. The basin appeared to offer a direct path across terrain that would otherwise require a lengthy detour around the thermal area. Snow conditions looked stable from his vantage point above the depression, and the uniform white surface suggested solid footing throughout the crossing. With no partner accompanying him and no radio contact scheduled until his next checkpoint, Rogan made the decision to attempt the traverse alone. As he descended into the basin, the snow depth appeared consistent with the surrounding area, showing no obvious signs of the thermal activity beneath. Geothermal venting continued beneath the surface throughout winter, releasing carbon dioxide that pooled in low-lying areas when air circulation was limited. The snow bridges above concealed these conditions, providing no visual warning of the environment below. Approximately 50 feet into the crossing, Rogan's weight caused a section of the snow bridge to collapse suddenly beneath him. The failure exposed a geothermal opening beneath the snowpack, releasing a concentrated pocket of carbon dioxide into the confined depression. The heavier-than-air gas spread outward along the basin floor, displacing breathable air near the surface. Rogan attempted to scramble away from the collapse, unaware that the air around him no longer contained sufficient oxygen. Within moments, his movements became uncoordinated as the oxygen-depleted environment affected his balance and strength. He managed several steps away from the broken snow bridge before his legs began to fail. He collapsed approximately 30 feet from the collapse point, unable to regain his footing. With limited airflow within the depression and snowbanks restricting ventilation, the low oxygen conditions persisted. Rogan lost consciousness where he fell. Hours later, search teams located Rogan's body near the edge of the thermal basin. The scene showed limited evidence of movement, with tracks leading away from the collapsed snow bridge for only a short distance. The medical examiner determined that asphyxiation due to oxygen displacement from carbon dioxide accumulation had caused his death. Following the incident, the thermal depression was permanently closed during the winter months. It was March 27, 2018, and mid-morning sun warmed a south rim viewpoint where a low stone barrier wall marked the canyon's edge. Beyond the wall, a narrow limestone ledge roughly 20 inches wide was visible approximately 14 feet below, its outer edge angling slightly away from the canyon wall. The drop beyond the ledge measured several hundred feet. Coltrane Wexley was 23 years old and in his final semester as a graphic design student in Atlanta, Georgia. He was visiting the Grand Canyon during spring break with 3 college friends, his first time seeing the canyon in person. An internship interview was scheduled for the following week, and he had spent months preparing a digital portfolio of his work. At the viewpoint, Coltrane stood beside the stone barrier, showing the portfolio on his phone to 2 of his friends. He scrolled through several projects, pointing out the designs he planned to present during the interview. Friends later told investigators that he mentioned he hadn't backed up the files in months and that losing the phone would effectively end the internship opportunity. As he leaned casually against the barrier while holding the phone, it slipped from his jacket pocket. It cleared the rim edge and came to rest on a narrow limestone ledge roughly 14 feet below. Display facing upward, the screen still lit. One friend immediately told him to leave it. The ledge sat well below the barrier, with several hundred feet of open canyon beneath it. Coltrane looked over the wall anyway, studying the rock face until he identified what appeared to be shallow handholds in the limestone. Within seconds, he began climbing down. He reached the narrow ledge. The handholds had held on the way down. The phone lay beside his shoe, its screen cracked but still glowing. He tried to hand it up to a friend leaning over the barrier, but the distance was too great. Instead, he tossed it upward. His friend reached for it but fumbled the catch. The phone bounced once on the rim and slid onto the paved viewing area above. It had made it back safely. Now standing on a ledge, barely wider than his shoes. Coltrane turned back toward the wall to climb out. The limestone fractured beneath him without warning. A thin, outer slab broke away from the formation under his weight. His hands reached for the wall, but found no hold at that height. The broken section of limestone and Coltrane's body dropped away from the cliff face together and disappeared into open air. Both friends witnessed the fall. Emergency services were called immediately. Coltrane's body was located on a rocky shelf, approximately 280 feet below. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be open cranial vault fractures, bilateral hemopneumothorax, and comminuted spinal and pelvic fractures, consistent with extreme distance freefall polytrauma. Investigators examined the fracture point. The separated section showed significant weathering along its underside, consistent with limestone exfoliation, where the outer face progressively detaches through thermal expansion and frost wedging, and can appear intact from above while already partially separated beneath. The phone was recovered from the rim surface. The portfolio and interview materials were intact. The park authority installed additional barrier fencing at the viewpoint within the same season. His design program held a memorial at the end of the academic year. It was September 3, 2016, when the canyon rim stretched along a precipitous edge overlooking a 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered sandstone, while intermittent wind gusts swept up from the depths, carrying dust and debris across the exposed plateau. Safety barriers had been installed along the most accessible viewing points, but the remote location meant that determined visitors could easily bypass these protections. Loose gravel and fractured rock accumulated near the edge where freeze-thaw cycles had gradually weakened the cliff face. Vancy Pyle, a 29-year-old warehouse supervisor and recreational drone enthusiast, had developed a passion for aerial photography during his off hours from managing logistics operations. His methodical approach to equipment and safety protocols at work contrasted sharply with his willingness to take risks when pursuing the perfect aerial shot. Known among fellow hobbyists for his technical expertise and ambitious flight plans, Vancy often sought out challenging locations that would showcase his piloting skills and camera equipment. His collection of aerial footage had gained recognition in online communities, fueling his desire to capture increasingly dramatic perspectives. The canyon location had attracted his attention due to reports of exceptional thermal updrafts that could extend flight times and enable complex maneuvers. His plan involved launching from an elevated position near the rim to take advantage of the natural air currents rising from the heated valley floor. The late afternoon timing would provide optimal lighting conditions for the high-resolution camera mounted on his aircraft. However, the designated launch areas behind the safety barriers offered limited clearance for takeoff operations. Determined to achieve an unobstructed launch sequence, Vancy climbed over the protective barrier and moved approximately 15 feet closer to the canyon edge. The position provided the clearance he needed for his equipment while offering an unparalleled view of the valley below. Wind conditions appeared favorable, with steady updrafts and minimal crosswinds that would support stable flight operations. His attention became completely focused on the technical aspects of equipment setup and pre-flight procedures. As Vancy adjusted his position to optimize the launch angle, his rear foot encountered a section of loose gravel that had accumulated near the rim. The small stones, destabilized by recent weather and thermal expansion, shifted beneath his weight without warning. His balance compromised, he stepped backward instinctively to regain stability, but the unstable surface continued to give way beneath him. The brief fall carried him approximately 12 feet down onto a narrow rock shelf that protruded from the cliff face. His chest struck the angled surface directly, the impact driving his sternum against the unyielding sandstone with significant force. The sudden chest-first collision created extreme deceleration forces concentrated at his torso. His thoracic aorta, the major artery carrying blood from the heart, ruptured internally from the catastrophic impact. Despite the relatively short distance of the fall and minimal external trauma, the internal damage proved immediately fatal. The aortic rupture caused rapid internal bleeding and circulatory collapse, leading to unconsciousness within seconds. His body remained on the narrow ledge, visible from above, but inaccessible without specialized rescue equipment. Emergency responders arrived within 2 hours, but the technical nature of the recovery operation required additional time to establish safe access to the ledge. Rescue specialists confirmed that death had occurred shortly after impact due to the severity of the internal injuries. The medical examiner confirmed thoracic aortic rupture from high-energy chest impact as the cause of death. Following the incident, additional warning signage was installed and the loose gravel areas were stabilized. It was March 22, 2018, and late winter light fell across a narrow sandstone corridor in a remote canyon system in southern Utah. Red-orange walls rose roughly 200 feet on either side, narrowing to less than 40 feet in places. The corridor floor, a dry wash littered with river cobble, sat in permanent shadow for most of the day. Brennick Solvaro was 31 years old and worked as a freelance drone videographer in Salt Lake City, Utah, shooting aerial footage for real estate firms, tourism boards, and outdoor media companies. He had picked up wingsuit base jumping 2 years earlier and logged approximately 80 flights from established desert cliff exits across the Southwest. His professional work had begun overlapping with his jumping. He scouted new proximity flight lines using his drones and sold the resulting wingsuit content to adventure media outlets. And here's where his process starts to look really impressive on paper. For this project, he had spent 3 weeks flying his drone through the corridor at varying altitudes, mapping the walls, overhangs, and constriction points on a tablet-based terrain model. Friends later told investigators he had mapped every contour from his drone surveys, but had never once hiked down into the canyon to see it from the ground. This was the detail jumped out at me immediately when I was researching this. They said he trusted what he saw on screens more than what he could see with his own feet. His planned flight line ran through the corridor at roughly 60 feet above the wash floor, threading the narrowest section where his surveys showed adequate clearance on both sides. He had flown the drone through at that altitude over a dozen times and was satisfied the line was clean. Now let me tell you how the morning played out. On the morning of the flight, Brennick hiked to the rim with a friend who planned to observe from the top. Conditions were clear. He performed his gear check, confirmed his line on the tablet one final time, and exited. His friend at the rim watched the entry, a clean exit, and stable flight into the corridor. The walls closed in on both sides as Brennick entered the narrow section. Then he disappeared from view below the rim line. His friend saw no parachute emerge from the far end of the corridor. He watched for several minutes, expecting Brennick to clear the narrows and deploy beyond the canyon mouth. When no canopy appeared, he called emergency services, but I can't imagine what that dreaded wait must have felt like. A search and rescue team reached the wash floor by late afternoon and found Brennick's body on the ground, roughly 60 feet below a steel cable spanning the width of the corridor. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be near-complete cervical transection with associated tracheal disruption and bilateral carotid and jugular lacerations. Death was instantaneous. The cable was later identified as a remnant of an early 20th century aerial ore tramway. Decades of oxidation had turned the steel the same rust orange as the surrounding sandstone, and its position fell within a shadow band cast by the eastern wall during afternoon hours, the same hours Brennick conducted his survey flights. In the drone footage he reviewed, the cable blended into the rock behind it and went unnoticed. 3 weeks of data, not visible in a single pass. The Land Management Agency removed the cable within weeks. If he had walked that canyon floor even once, he might have seen it. That's the part I can't let go of. All right, this next story is just baffling to me. He had 200 skydives on paper, and it still wasn't enough.